So welcome to everybody also from my side. Today is part two of the second part of the webinar, that in which we share some of the insights that the authors of the recent volume have developed. And this is the volume Organizing for Societal Grand Challenges in the Research in the Sociology of Organizations. So this book is actually the first RSO volume that is fully open access, and you can download all the chapters in the link that I've posted here below, and I will also later on send around the PDF of the whole book. So last week we had Hannah, Madeleine and Nicole in the session, and today we have part two. Today Sascha will talk about outreach activities and Matteo about teaching. And I also want to mention last time's session because today's session is not great in terms of gender balance, but if you also consider the last session, we actually perfectly balanced. So because we also care about that. Quick words about the two speakers. Or actually first about myself. I'm Emilio. I'm an assistant professor at the Rotterdam School of Management. Sascha, he is a professor at the Berlin University of Arts, and he will speak about outreach activities. Matteo is an assistant professor in the finance and accounting department at the Alliance School of Management at the University of Manchester, Alliance School of Management. And in terms of the schedule, we'll start with Sascha. He will briefly present the ideas about outreach activities. Then we have a Q&A. Then we have a short presentation by Matteo, again a Q&A, and then we have a Mentimeter quiz prepared for you in which we ask you something about how you relate to outreach activities and teaching. Then in a panel with Sascha and Matteo, they will then discuss your reaction and also have a further discussion about that, the overarching discussion about the responsibility of researchers. During the presentation, we would like to ask you to actually ask your questions in the chat so that we then basically can select the questions with which we will start, because we may not have time to cover all the questions. And also, please try to relate this to your own experiences in terms of outreach activities and teaching. So try to think about what Sascha and Matteo tell us, how this applies to your case, and also what questions you have based on your experience, so that we can make this discussion as practical and as helpful as possible. Because we're talking about something quite practical, ultimately, like engaging in outreach activities and teaching around grand challenges. Yeah, so that's it from my side. So Sascha, I hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me fine. I guess that's a yes. Thanks, Emilio. Hi, everyone here. I'm happy to talk a little bit about an article that I co-wrote, which is called Striving for Societal Impact as an Early Career Researcher, Reflections on 5 Common Concerns. So my name is Sascha Friesike. I'm a professor for the design of digital innovation, whatever exactly that is, at the art school in Berlin. And I'm also director of the Weizmann Institute for the Networked Society. And at this institute, we are very much engaged scholars, and we try to do research on phenomena and be in dialogue with the phenomena. So the idea of impact work, of going outside as a researcher and actually having an impact on the world, is something that goes over my desk a lot. And when we did this RSO special issue, we thought when we talk about grand challenges, we should really also have an article on impact work, because hardly anyone goes out and says, I would like to do research on grand challenges because I really want to theorize about it and not touch the rest of the world. Everybody who I know who works on these topics kind of has an interest in also engaging with the world outside there. And when we discussed this, we had one kind of like starting observation, and that what is if you look at older scholars, if they either don't do impact work at all because they never learned really how to do that, and so they solely are within academia, or they kind of have always done it. So when we think about that, then as an early career researcher, this is kind of like a turning point. Either you start doing impact work and you get better at it and you learn doing it, so you will do more over time, or you don't start doing it and you'll probably not take it up later on. And that was the starting point for our discussion, and we thought we should write about that. We should think about what that means. And we all know that impact work is currently something that is highly asked for. If you write a grant proposal, they will ask you what kind of impact work you're doing. There's this book that probably some of you have read, The Engaged Scholar, about how important it is to go out and talk to the world. And so what we did when we started with the article is that we talked to a lot of early career researchers, and we asked them, what are the problems, the questions, the issues that you have with impact work? And then we kind of distilled them. And what we found is, number one, we kind of had this premise that you need to start impact work early on in your career, but there is hardly a PhD program that includes it. So typically PhD programs are very heavy on methodology. They are very heavy on publishing, on how the academic industry works and how to give a presentation at a conference and how to write a review and how to deal with the rejection and so on. But we hardly found any courses that really deal with impact work and teach young scholars how to go outside and talk with the phenomenon that they're interested in and actually have an impact on them. And that struck us as kind of interesting. And so we collected all these topics that people had and these questions, and we kind of compiled them into 5 topics that we found a lot of people were struggling with. And this is what I'll briefly go through here, and I put them on these cards so that I don't have to show you slides. So the first one we found is that many young researchers said, do I even have time for this? I'm very busy writing academic articles, and it gets more and more competitive to do these articles. I don't have additional time to also engage with the rest of society because it's such a tough and competitive job to do academic research. And then we looked at our own work, and we looked at the impact activities we have done, and we clearly identified that some of the stuff we were engaged in, or presentations that we gave, or people that invited us, were completely useless and an enormous waste of our time. But there were also a lot of things that we were involved in that actually provided us with insights or access to data which otherwise we wouldn't have had. And so what we wrote about in the article is that we think there is kind of like a false dichotomy dividing the work of an academic between impact work and academic work, and you kind of have to find time within your schedule to do them both. We think it's more useful probably to think about it in a way that some types of impact work might actually enrich the academic work that you do. And so it's more a question of a selection function, which kind of impact work do you engage in to actually get something meaningful out of it. And all of these 5 concerns in the article, given that I only have 15 minutes, I'll be kind of brief, but we always put a little case study in them to illustrate what we mean with them out of our own experience. So we think that there's some truth to that, but if you really look at the different activities you can be engaged in, there might be a lot of meaning and learning opportunities in them. So we think if you look at it as a false dichotomy, that might be helpful. And the second thing we found is, should I focus on impact activities that count? And what we mean by that is we see an increasing effort to count impact activities. If you have, for instance, seen altmetrics, you see how often specific papers are mentioned on social media or in the news. And so everything that is countable now gets counted, and we see young researchers that then struggle with the question, well, which type of impact work should I do? Should I do the one that currently goes into some kind of metrics? Should I be very active on Twitter, for instance, so I can show that my paper gets a higher altmetric score because more people retweet that I wrote a new article. And we think that there is people conflate attention with impact. So you can have an enormous amount of impact on a small group of people and nobody online sees it. So it's not countable, but it's very meaningful. And by shifting the focus of an individual young researcher rather on what kind of work is meaningful might be way more useful for people than to think about, oh, what of that will have a number that we can count and that we can put then in an alt metric. And another thing, when we looked at all these cases we found in our own work and that we thought might be interesting is we found an enormous amount of indirect effects from impact work that helped us later on. So we had this one instance where I did a little video lecture series, and at the time, I kind of did it because there was a big production value behind it. And I thought it's interesting to do that once, to be in front of a camera and to do these courses. I didn't really think that the course itself will change a lot of people's lives, but I like the production value behind it and seeing how this is done. That was kind of before COVID. And then COVID hit. And because I had done these classes on these video lectures, it was very easy for me to do some of my own lectures then also as videos, because I kind of had learned how to write for that and how to work with the camera and set it up and everything. So it had an indirect effect that helped me later on. And what we found is that when you think about impact work in a way of what type of work do I want to do down the road, and is this in line with the type of work that I would like to do, then that is a more useful selection criteria than to think about attention alone, because a lot of things can be very meaningful to some people, but do not create an enormous amount of attention. The third one we found is, are my findings too incremental? It's like a typical thing that PhD students have, that they say, well, I do this work, I write this paper, and my finding is such a little detail that I add to the conversation that's already there. Is that even meaningful enough to share that? And one thing we found kind of interesting in thinking about that and reflecting is that if you are a PhD student, there is an enormous value in the stuff that you know, and not only in the stuff that you find out. So if you go to an academic conference and you give a presentation, the presentation is geared to what the one thing that you find out. And it might be a little detail, might be a little add-on to an already existing theory. But if you go to an audience outside of academia, they are pretty much unaware of the theoretical undercurrent that you build your work on. And so the stuff that you have read and that you can contextualize and translate to their setting might actually be very meaningful to them, instead of only focusing on this very tiny detail that you yourself have as a finding in your first paper. And we found when we talked to these young researchers that they're kind of hesitant to share their finding, because I think I only have this one paper out and I worked on it for 3 years, but that little thing that I found, who really cares? And by turning that around and thinking about all the stuff that I had to read to get to my finding might actually be meaningful to someone if I'm able to translate that to their world, because they don't have the time to read all that and look at all that. So that we found like it's a useful trick to think about, how can I provide meaning? The fourth one we found is, my findings are not actionable, so how are they useful? So a lot of young researchers have this idea that impact work needs to be normative. So they think they need to go out to the public and give them kind of like an instruction manual on how to act. Because a lot of the stuff that we, for instance, in business school teach, like frameworks, have this construction manual inside them and give people a way to make decisions. And when we looked at interesting cases of impact work, what we found is hardly any of them are actually normative. A lot of them do something where they make something visible for people that otherwise wasn't visible, or they provide option rooms, or they show how to look at the world. They give them a typology, they name things that were prior unnamed, and give them a vocabulary or something like that. So we had this one example in the article on path dependency, which as a theory, once you understand it, you can see that again outside and you can show people, well, the problem that you're dealing with actually is one of path dependency, but it's not a normative theory that provides you with an answer on what exactly to do here, but it's more a way of seeing and providing young people with the idea that being able to tell people that there is actually a language and there is a way of looking at this and spotlighting specific things, giving them vocabulary in itself is already meaningful. So it doesn't need to be an actionable insight like a framework. And another thing we found, which we find interesting for this article, is a lot of these very actionable frameworks that look academic actually come from outside of academia, like from consultancies, for instance, and then are kind of painted in an academic fashion to make them more academic. So that was something we wrote about also, which we found kind of interesting. The last one we had is, what if I say something wrong? And what if I say something wrong is something that will probably happen. So if you do something that is meaningful and reaches a lot of people, then there will be criticism. And so we didn't want to put that under the rug and hide it, but we wanted to have a discussion about that and wanted to encourage people to do it anyways and to engage and learn how to deal with this criticism. In a way, I always say it's 10 times easier to criticize something than to actually do it. And so you will find sorts of criticism, and that we covered a couple of cases of very prominent criticism. Typically, if you start out doing impact work, it will not be such an enormous disaster, but there is a different language that is spoken if you go to an academic conference where people say, well, we really liked your talk, but I have some questions on the methodology, which actually means I really didn't like that, in comparison to impact work outside of academia, where the tone might be way harsher. So given that I'm already pretty deep in my conversation, I wanted to share a little bit of a model that we did in the paper, and that is that we said there's different ways of looking at impact in itself. And we oftentimes have this idea, we call this an heroic view on impact, that there is this one activity, that one big activity that leads to impact. So we know these very famous books like Structure of Scientific Revolution that go on for 50 years and have an enormous amount of impact. And we think there needs to be this heroic activity that then leads to impact. And as a young researcher, I don't have this one great theory, so I might not have impact at all. And we think this is a view that kind of comes from after the fact. You can say that at the end of a career that one work had really big impact, but it's a bad way of looking at impact. And another way we found is, we call this a non-heroic view on impact. So there's a lot of activities that are happening because, for instance, they count in alt metrics and they go in all kinds of directions, but together they don't really make sense. So doing everything, not really selecting and thinking about what is meaningful for the type of work I would like to do, might be non-heroic, but might also lead nowhere. And so we thought about this and said, there might be the need for something like, we call this a post-heroic view on impact work, where you start very small with small activities that you do, and over time they get bigger and bigger and more meaningful, but you do them in a direction where you think about what is the type of work that I want to stand for, and then you work over time on that, and you have directed activities that get better and bigger with the experience that you gain over time. So you can start very early on as a PhD student, but you're probably not starting out with writing the seminal book that will change everything, but doing it step by step might actually lead you to impact over time that is meaningful and good. And with that, I think I'll hit the 50-minute mark. I would like to stop here and go into a little bit of Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sascha, for this wonderful presentation. So what I've seen of your outreach activities, I find them really fascinating. For example, Sascha has recently done something for one of the big German radio station, in which he has explained isomorphism with really cool examples, and I'm sure that will have a big reach. But my question would have been, given your post-heroic model of outreach activities or engagement, Could you maybe tell us a little bit where you started? Because we now see what you do now, but basically give us maybe one further example of where you started small, because your article is about like how early career scholars can do something. So could you basically tell us a little bit more about what you did back then and how this relates to the work that you're now doing?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit of an odd case because I was in a very fortunate position that my PhD supervisor was very active in impact activities and would always take PhD students with him. So I think it's a situation that not a lot of PhD students are in. So I was very early on basically put in front of an audience to provide them with presentations that weren't academic, and then afterward receive feedback from my supervisor, because that's something he was personally very active in. So we always had industry collaborations at the institute I did my PhD in, and I was probably in a situation that a lot of PhD students are not in. But when I look at the institute I am currently at, I see that it really depends on the type of research that you do, what kind of an audience that is interesting for. And what I see is when you do academic work and you think that this is meaningful to a specific audience, typically people are not very hesitant to talk to you. This might be different if you are a journalist, then they might think, oh, well, I'm not really sure what they're doing now. But I think having this coming from an academic institution oftentimes in itself provides you with a foot in the door, because people are kind of interested in to see you as someone who is probably more objective and provides them maybe with the views. I think getting started that way, I see that with our PhD students, is something that is oftentimes possible. And then I think one thing I didn't really talk about is that we all have very different personal abilities and interests, and aligning impact work with things that actually are easy to us and are fun to us and we really want to engage with makes it far easier. So if you are not really a good public speaker and it's a very tough time for you, then maybe don't start out by giving public lectures, but maybe it's way easier for you to engage in social media because it's more of your medium. And reflecting that, and then also seeing who does a good job doing that, and can I maybe collaborate with them, get in touch with them, talk to them, to over time get a little bit better, I think it's an avenue.
That's super interesting to hear that you basically learned the craft, as a PhD student by learning from mentors. Yeah. Who else has questions? And if you have questions, so I don't see any questions in the chat, so just feel free to ask questions. And yeah, Nasrin, and great that you have the video, the camera on. Thank you. Nasrin, please.
Thank you very much, Sascha, for the interesting presentation. And I have actually a question about rule number 4, the practical contributions. We often hear that we need to show the practical contribution of our findings, practical applications of our findings. So how does that make sense, that if we just express our feelings, our findings, that is possible, but the audience is not necessarily ready to hear, to find the applications on their own. We need to feed them that this is exactly the application. So how do we balance?
Yeah, thank you. So this is just, my findings are not actionable. So how are they useful? And what we talk about in this aspect is that a lot of academic findings can be very useful, yet they are not normative in a way that they tell a manager exactly how to make a decision. And I actually do a little bit of a PhD program in Amsterdam on impact activities. And this is one of the sessions that we do, that we kind of draw a continuum from there are these actionable insights. For instance, somebody found out that it makes sense to wash your hand as a practicing doctor before every single patient that you see. So it's a very little finding, but it had an enormous impact. It's very, very normative. But in the social sciences, most of the cases that we found weren't that small and that normative, but they were more of offering guidance, that they say, well, there is a couple of scenarios. Depending on the situation that you're in, it might go this way, it might go that way. To show that, to show the contingencies, to show options, to give people a way of reflecting that. And then if you ask in impact work, actually sitting down with them, discussing what does that mean in your specific context, might be way more helpful to guide them into the direction, what should we think about, than providing them simply with answers and saying, this is what you need to do. And then on this continuum, on the very far end, we have something which we call spotlighting, where this is actually just making things visible that otherwise weren't visible. So simply by giving a name to something offers them the option to talk about it and say, that is actually a thing. They have the theory. So the isomorphism example from Emilio that we did this little video clip about is something, once you see once somebody explains the theory to you, you will see that in your office job the next day. There will be something where say, that's what he talked about. So it gives you a lens to see the world, and then you can draw conclusions from seeing that and saying, what does that mean for the decisions that we make? And I think oftentimes when we talk to PhD students, they think that their impact work needs to provide people with a decision already, with an answer. Well, a lot of the successful cases we looked at actually provides them with looking at something and then reflecting for themselves what that means in their context, and that they should think about that, and that might actually encourage them to reflect and maybe look at the world a little bit differently. And I just want to encourage young people to say, that there's value in doing that.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Sascha. Thanks. That's very interesting. And I have several questions, but maybe I could start with one by one. You talk about impact work. You allude to the expression impact work quite a few times, but I would presume that not all impact work is made equal, so to speak. Do you have a view on what particular impact work could be more impactful, so to speak, than others? Either from your own experience or from your discussions with others?
Yeah. So when I talk about impact work, what I mean is work that actually does something, has like a follow-up communication of some sort outside of academia. So I mean something that happens because of academic work that happens outside of academia. And given that people have very different research topics and very different ways of engaging with the public, I wouldn't say here is a ranking of activities and these activities are better than other activities. I think it's way more important that as a researcher yourself reflecting on which is a way to, so first of all, who would I like to talk to? Who is my audience? Who do I want to have an impact on? What is their problem? What could they learn from the stuff that I read, that I know, that I do work on? And then what's a vehicle that I can climb into, or that I can cooperate with, or that I can do a collaboration with, to actually get to that audience? And given that we talk to very different audiences that have very different problems, there isn't really the one thing to do. I oftentimes think that there is certain underserved markets. So I think a couple of years ago, for instance, podcasting in Germany was kind of an underserved market. So by doing an academic podcast, you could reach an audience very quickly in comparison to, for instance, writing in a trade magazine. But over time, we've seen an avalanche of podcasts, and now I would look at this a little bit differently and say kind of it became an oversaturated market, so it's not that easy anymore to have an impact with that work. So I think it really depends on the situation, it depends on the audience you would like to reach, and it really depends on the type of work that you do, and personally, what works for you. So I, for instance, am hardly ever active on social media because it's not really my medium. I have no idea how to play it, and I get bored after a couple of minutes. But both of my co-authors on this article are very active and will tell you how important it is to reach an audience on social media. So it's really different for different people. But you had more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sascha. So just continuing on this topic of impact work, the way you talk about us, in a way, what I'm sensing is you're encouraging us to engage in impact work. But in large extent, you kind of allude to it as a one-way street, so to speak, in that we're doing the impact work. Could you comment on how doing the impact work can also impact us, so to speak, in that whether by taking our ideas, our insights into the world can also help us perhaps rethink the way we see those insights and ideas?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because at my institute, there is a long-standing debate between should we use the term transfer work, because transfer kind of thinks that we need to transfer something to an audience out there, which is a way of a deficit view of the audience, that we have the superior knowledge and they don't. And so typically we use the word dialogue for impact work, because most of the time it's not really you going out and praising the findings that you have and say, here's an insight from academia that is really useful to you, but it's more of a dialogue where we find interesting phenomena by engaging with stakeholder groups, and they find interesting findings from science. So it's a back and forth. And given that back and forth, this dialogue is typically also the reason why people keep being engaged. And there's specific forms that we do that are very dialogue heavy. So for instance, when we do a roundtable thing where people really share what they work on, then it's way more of a dialogue. If you give a presentation, it's probably more of a transfer, it's more of a monologue, and then you have a bit of a Q&A. So it depends, but I'm totally with you that like having a deficit view and saying here is science and we have all the answers really isn't an approach that is helpful to anyone.
Well, I guess I was thinking more along the lines that it's not only the case that the audience has some sort of deficit, but maybe it's also a case that there is still space for us to further elaborate on our insights, on our thinking. And therefore, by taking those ideas to the real world, so to speak, it also opens an opportunity for us to refine them and maybe and perhaps even further expand what else could be looked into.
Absolutely. And also it's something I found several times, that if you talk to an audience outside of academia, they look at your work very differently and ask different questions. Well, if you go to an academic conference, oftentimes you get the very same questions and they kind of push you into a specific way of thinking. And it might be a way of thinking that makes it easier to publish, but oftentimes it kind of waters your finding down to something that might be publishable, but less interesting. And oftentimes if you go outside of academia, you get questions that really kind of sideline your work. And then you reflect, oh, what is this? Might be some way to look at it differently that I haven't thought about before. So I think, yes, absolutely, there's value in that, specifically if you build longer relationships to people outside of academia that kind of understand where you're coming from, understand your work, and you don't only have like a 50-minute interview with them, but some. So I have several people that I meet for lunch from time to time, simply to show them a couple ideas that we work on currently. And oftentimes they have very clever ideas and understandings of the stuff that we do that oftentimes really enrich the way we look at it. Yeah. But I think we have to move on. There's so much more ground to cover. So I'll shut up.
Emad, maybe we can come back to the latter, to the further questions in the panel discussion. Sascha, thank you so much for your presentation and your comments. Just one last question. Could you actually post in the chat afterwards how you set up this amazing setup? Because it's like everything is, it's just a joy to see you talking with this background and with the cards. I also wonder what camera do you actually have, because it seems like your picture seems to be sharper as all the other pictures. So if you could just like 2 or 3 sentences basically sharing some knowledge, and the background is really, you should share it as a virtual background. I could actually use a more fancy background. So.
Yeah, I haven't said that in the beginning. This is my daughter's art gallery. She just turned 4, and we have like this co-working situation here where she uses my office as her art gallery, and I use her art gallery as my office, and that's how the background's coming together. Yeah. But I'll post a couple of things that I do. Sure.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So, Matteo, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Emilio. I'll try to share my slides because I'm adopting a slightly more conventional approach, perpetuating the tyranny of PowerPoint. So apologies for that. So again, thanks a lot for this opportunity of presenting the some of the main points emerging from the work that I did with Marian Gatzweiler from Edinburgh and Corinna Freyhager from Rotterdam. And in this paper, in the special issue, we reflect on the status of the knowledge that we have on grand challenges and some of the implication that this has in the way in which we teach, we learn, and we educate in business schools. And specifically, we wanted to problematize and reflect on some of these idea of barriers to learning and how to potentially overcome them. However, in this presentation, we'll focus more on our own, in a sense, conceptualization of the barriers to then ideally open up to a conversation of, are there more, are there different barriers? What do you think about those barriers and how we could go about overcoming them? So we'll focus more on the front end on the paper rather than more of the proposition and suggestion that we make in the back. And
Matteo, just briefly, you shared the presenter view, so could you actually share we just see one slide, otherwise.
Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Sorry about that, I didn't realize. Thanks, Emilio. So as I was saying, I think the one of our main concern was also taking a bit of a phenomenological approach to reflecting on the status of the knowledge we have on grand challenges, because there is something particular about it. And to illustrate this point, I would like to reflect on or use this image, which is quite, I think, aesthetically evocative and sublime, to make some points about grand challenges. So this is an image that was taken by Noah Berger for the Associated Press in 2020 during the wildfires that were destroying, devastating California at the time. And this was going on at the exact same time period where at the peak, at the initial phases of the COVID pandemic. And we can see here this sign saying, "Senior Center, come and join us, wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, stay safe." And this image, I think, really captures several aspects that are quite important of grand challenges. The first one is that, in a sense, as this image shows, what is actually tragic has its roots in what is almost comical about some of this problem, because this image has, of course, some surreal characteristics. But also it makes us think about how all of these grand challenges that we are experiencing are interconnected. Just because during the pandemic, our tunnel vision was all focused on making sense and trying to implement some measures and actions to tackle that and to do something about it, doesn't mean that the climate emergency disappear in the background. Also, if we read the content of this sign here that is in this hellish landscape, we reflect on this idea of, senior center. This hints at the fact that we also have an aging crisis in some Western countries. This idea of washing your hands, social distance, the psychological crisis that might ensue. And we were really struck about also this idea of how it feels to learn about these topics. The more you think about it, the less you might feel you know. The fact that you develop knowledge over many years about some of these issues does not mean that this knowledge can be translated easily into actionable propositions, best practices, or prescriptions that can be applied easily. And also, in a sense, what emerges from this appreciation of this status of the knowledge is that the knowledge we have about grand challenges is seldom what we call in the paper a terra firma, something that we can reliably rely on and deploy, but is always something which is constantly unfolding. that changes depending on how multiple crises are interrelated. The knowledge that we have, we say, is shifting like a kaleidoscope. It changes shapes. It can be reconfigured in many different aspects. And when we are confronted with such extreme and problematic issues and context, learning about these issues can be profoundly a profoundly uncomfortable experience, both because it is difficult, but also because it makes us confront with our own, in a sense, impotence about maybe doing something more or seeing how certain things can be resolved. So with these opening remarks, we, in a sense, really then went into trying to develop a bit further this idea of uncomfortable knowledge, which we borrowed from a paper by Steve Rainer in 2012, where he theorizes uncomfortable knowledge as knowledge that challenges both individual and organizational actors' value-based self-perception, organizing principles, and some of their sources of legitimacy. Of course, if such knowledge can challenge all of the above, there are incentives, implicit and explicit, in place to keep it as far as possible from the organizational actors themselves. However, not unveiling and not tackling this, asking these tough questions about aspects or actions that might challenge all of the above can undermine organizational and individual learning to a considerable degree. And Reiner says that he has identified 4 main strategies in increasing order of complexity through which organization and people keep this uncomfortable knowledge at bay. Denial is the first one he proposes, this idea of I simply deny that something is a problem and I move on. That can be both conscious and unconscious. Dismissal is a bit more elaborate because it implies declaring that something is actually not an issue. And then we go into the more explicit and sophisticated one, such as diversion, saying that might be a problem, but this other problem is way more important. We should all focus our attention on that, and pretending something else doesn't exist or affect us. Or displacement, which is the more sophisticated one, the idea of managing a representation of a problem rather than a problem. And we're really trying to apply this idea to this idea of learning about grand challenges and also learning about how we learn about grand challenges. And that's why I put up this image from this painting, The False Mirror by Magritte. That this is a painting that sees as much as it is itself seen. And in a sense, with this phenomenological underpinning of this idea, it starts from looking inward about how we engage, how we reflect, and what can we do to foster learning in the classroom in such a way that would allow students and people to get more involved in teaching, learning, and doing something about grand challenges. And through the prism of uncomfortable knowledge, we identified 3 barriers that I will talk you through very briefly in the following couple of slides. The first one is the barrier of cognitive overload, which we formulated as something that occurs in situations that put excessive demands on people's capacity for processing, for cognitive processing, and can limit the way in which people, such as students or learners more broadly, learn, mobilize, and apply knowledge to unfolding situation, crisis situations, grand challenges scenarios. But we discuss it and we unpack it along 2 different dimensions. The first one is the more conventional cognitive one, which is what I just hinted at. But I think there is also a more interesting dimension of this barrier of cognitive overload, which is more to do with the epistemic status of the knowledge we have. An example here from this article that was in Nature at the beginning of the COVID pandemic: is the coronavirus airborne? Expert can't agree. And we contend that the plurality of insights that can emerge from legitimate disciplines such as medicine, biology, but also economics or policy is not something that necessarily is able to be reassuringly and easily relied on. For instance, during the pandemic, even practitioners and scientists with common epistemic frames of references, such as the virologists, could agree about how, for instance, the virus was unfolding and to prevent viral transmission. And of course, then this creates other problems, such as how this individual crisis connects with others, such as the mental health that we mentioned briefly before. These are just examples to show that this is not only an issue of cognition and limited aspect of cognitive factors, but is also about the epistemic status of the knowledge itself and the knowledge controversies that can emerge around grand challenge topics and issues. And we also took issue with this, some of the main approaches that were emerging in the pedagogical literature on how to deal with such concepts that we found were really trying to push for ideas of simplification, ideas of functional decompositions. And we argue that in such interconnected and mutually influencing and reciprocally intensifying concepts such as grand challenges, that can be a recipe for disaster that leads for potential for intensification, polarized solutions. And we argue that this idea of simplifying, decomposing can really keep uncomfortable knowledge at bay rather than blow up the significance of the uncomfortable knowledge about also these epistemic tensions and challenges. So this is the first barrier to learning about grand challenges that we formulated in the paper. We then identify one that is tightly connected to this one, which is this idea of emotional detachment. So emotional detachment is something that prevents individuals and organizations from feeling connected and touched by calls for action to act on specific problems. The idea of detachment is sometimes praised as a form of mental assertiveness that allow people to maintain impartiality, retain clarity of thought, and so on. But we argue that especially in the classroom, we can really use emotions to prompt and to generate involvement and to create attachment to issues that might otherwise be perceived as remote, far away, distant from our daily lives. And when we're reflecting on this issue, this idea of uncomfortable knowledge and this idea of a more phenomenological take on these issues, I think is really encapsulated quite nicely in this quote from this book on how everything can collapse by Severin and Stevens. And where they say that reflection and emotions are intimately mixed in an ecological eschatology where issues of life and death, personal and collective, are the very objects of the investigations. When we study grand challenges, we cannot approach these issues believing that our lives will not be turned upside down as a result. The images and thoughts of collapse that now populate our minds are mixed in an indecomposable alloy that cannot be reduced to its various components. So this is, again, the idea against the challenges and the idea of simplifying, of functional decomposing things, and leveraging the emotive and affective responses that can be associated to the study of such phenomena. And this is why I put these paintings by Munch, this painting called Anxiety, that anticipated the feelings and the horrors of the First World War, or this biblical representation of the apocalypse by Martin, which are something that I think quite well encapsulate some of the emotive aspects that we can feel when we think about some of these issues, and that can ignite and create a sense of attachment and coming closer to the subjects at hand. So this is another barrier to be overcome in our analysis when it comes to learning and teaching on these subjects. And the last one that we developed is something that I think most of us as organizational scholars will relate to, which is this barrier of organizational obliviousness, which relates to how learning on grand challenges can be disregarded at the business school's organizational and institutional level. And also, these are some simple examples that we break it down a bit more in a fine-grained manner in the paper between explicit and implicit barriers. Some of the implicit barriers can relate to how grand challenges is sometimes labeled as a hype. It's a body of knowledge that is becoming is very well established in top journals, in top publication, and so on. But the translation from the recognized publication outlets to the day-to-day teaching, for instance, activities is, at least where I work, far from being achieved. Also, another barrier is tightly connected to the unsurprising instrumentalist aspiration that characterize many of the, for instance, master programs or the rhetoric that exists around business schools. But then there's also aspect of dismissal, as we were saying before, and path dependency. Certain people have always done things in a certain way, and the idea of asking to a very senior tenure professor to change all of the case studies they've been teaching for 20 years can be an uncomfortable conversation to be had, for instance. There are also some more implicit issues that some of them I'm already into that before. This idea of the fact that while our research on this topic can very well developed on the teaching side, the translation integration might be a bit more complicated, and also the fact that sometimes I think I can also speak for myself. I'm also guilty of that, on not always treating teaching as value adding as it might be. Sometimes when you have some extra spare time, we much rather work on our R&Rs and stuff like that rather than revising our cases or amending our curriculum sometimes. So this is the third barrier to learning that complicates learning on grand challenges in the educational environment of business schools. And in the paper, we go into more depth into a variety of other topics, but some of the implications that emerge from our study on what we can do about this are as follows. The first suggestion we had, drawing from our experience, is that it's very difficult to expect broad and coordinated support from a school or a department or something like that. So a very pragmatic advice would be overall your material and teaching case studies. And for instance, I teach quite a bit of grand challenges topics in a management accounting course. It can be done, but don't expect any praise, brownie points, or support from broader context. Sometimes you can actually expect quite the opposite, because especially if students like it, that can put you in quite awkward situations with colleagues sometimes. So it's a bit of a tricky thing to do, and I think it's we should start doing this on our own without expecting broader support. Another aspect that I think it's quite interesting that we problematize in the paper is this idea of we should try to refrain from giving simple quote-unquote solutions to complex problems. And particularly, we problematize this idea that if you're interested in, I would be happy to unpack more in the Q&A of ontological gerrymandering, which is this idea of making one science unproblematic by making another one problematic. So the idea is to try and promote some cognitive styles that acknowledge the limitations of the different bodies of knowledge that can inform action on grand challenges and equip students to deal with all of these shortcomings and gaps that are unavoidable, to avoid, again, polarization, binary thinking, and so on and so forth. Another one of the suggestions that we put forth is to create attachment. One of the ways could be to rely on communicative media, and for instance, visualizations and artworks or aspects of that kind that can create new visibilities. facilitate unforeseen connection and defamiliarize the audience to create attachment, and also not being afraid of evocative feelings such as anxiety, anger, and so on, because this can hopefully turn uncomfortable knowledge into an engine for change, and motivate and hopefully enthuse and inspire also students and learners to do more about this topic. So these are the main points from our papers, and really our paper. I look forward to hear what you have to say about the barriers and some of the implications, and also some of the connection maybe with the conversation, with the presentation by Sascha earlier on. And I always end with how I begin a presentation. So back to this quite powerful image and thing. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Matteo. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I will start with a question of my own. So you mentioned you include grand challenges in a management accounting class, which I find quite fascinating. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you managed to do that?
Yeah, for instance, with Marian, who I think is somewhere in the virtual room. I saw him before. We also have done some work on that was based on Marian's field work on the performance evaluation practices in the management of refugee camps. And for instance, one of the ways in which I did this translation in my course was to introduce some of the accounting challenges or the performance measurement and evaluation challenges that relate to dealing with high reliability organizations and organizations of that kind, and how and in which way we can design evaluation systems that are fit for purpose in dynamic and ever-changing extreme scenarios. So that is one of the interfaces that, for instance, I have built in this translation. Another one would be the study of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are ever before seen quantitative and metrological infrastructure that surrounds action on all the different objectives and so on. And that is really partly incredibly sophisticated performance measurement and management system with 260, 280, I don't remember exactly, indicators that populate each and every one of the SDGs. And for instance, with my students that have quite a bit of a sensitivity towards numbers, I think there are a lot of opportunities to reflect on how their expertise in those subjects can also affect the formulation or the reflection or the contextualization and the analysis of how those performance measures and indicators are developed. So these are some of the main topic in which, in my personal case, I've operated this translation from my own research, but also the research that other people have done in the topic, and what you can do in a fairly orthodox management accounting class in a business school.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Jane, you have a question? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Your last quote, Matteo, really struck me because of my own research, which is exploring how emotion can actually mobilize action in the context of social movements. And I'm looking specifically at diversity and inclusion in organizations in light of the Black Lives Matter social movement. And in my interview study, I've been getting a lot of mention of uncomfortable, feeling uncomfortable. So I would love to hear, so your choice of words really rung true with me. I would love to hear any particular examples, I guess, as to what compelled you to formulate those words.
And by quote, you mean, which quote were you referring to?
I'm sorry, I wrote it down. It was the emotions generated by uncomfortable reactions can be the engine of change.
Yeah. In a sense, I feel like one of the ways in which this can be translated also in the environment of the classroom. For instance, my students, they're third-year students mostly, they study mostly accounting as such subjects. They have never thought about that these issues can translate into life and death situations. And the fact that making them engage and resonate about how this could have very strong implication. And when they look at an indicator, is one thing if you're talking about a KPI in the delivery of a project, a key performance indicator in the delivery of a project, but we also have KPIs when it comes to the delivery of nutrition supplies in a refugee camp that really have direct consequence of the life of thousands of people. And they really, you can feel that when you talk to them about this issue, that you see their the way they think really changing, attributing different meanings. And I think also there is a bit of an emphasis now in the current rhetoric of really coddling students and reassuring them and so on, but even confronting them with the reality of some of the crises that we're experiencing, and can really, I think, interest them in new subjects. And it can be sometimes complex, again, this translation, but I think it is worth to try and provoke them also in this respect.
Thank you.
Further questions?
I have it. Okay, let's go ahead.
Yeah.
You go ahead, Nazarene.
So maybe Ellie first, and yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. And I understood was that uncomfortable knowledge creates some barriers. And my question is, what if the uncomfortable knowledge comes from some industry interests, and they can sometimes make coalition and spread misinformation? And what we can do for this? I understand that the some insights from outside of the academic world sometimes refine our theoretical understanding. However, sometimes this is very destructive, and I'd like to know your insights.
Thanks for the question. I think the interesting aspect of uncomfortable knowledge relates to this idea that it can be both implicit or a self-preservation mechanism that is something that we unconsciously rely on in order to prevent ourselves from falling into despair or other types of emotion that could question the legitimacy of certain organizations. But as you pointed out, it can also be done for political purposes, for instance, or for reputational purposes. For instance, the fossil fuel industry had known for many years, since this late 70s or early 80s, about some of the impacts that they were having on those aspects, on climate change, pollution, CO2 emissions, and so on and so forth. But really, it is a concept that operates at both levels. And I think unmasking and questioning certain rhetoric is useful, but I think the interesting part is also unmasking our own in a sense, blind spot and implicit attitudes that we don't want to bring to the surface because they might challenge us. This is also important. That is why in this presentation, for teaching purposes, I've placed more emphasis on the introspective aspect of uncomfortable knowledge, because I think that is the less problematized aspect, because there is a fair bit of literature and work done, for instance, on how corporations are engaging in impression management and a variety of other techniques to try and divert attention away. So I think it's important to recognize that uncomfortable knowledge operates at two different levels, and we should keep an eye on both, in a sense.
Thank you.
So last short question by Ibrat, and then short answer by Matteo.
Well, yeah, it's a question to Matteo, but also if Sascha wanted to chip in as well. I mean, I guess what I'm sensing from both of your presentations is that it's an invitation or encouragement for people to engage in doing impactful work around growing challenges. But from your own experience, could you perhaps also talk about what are some of the challenges you experienced in trying to do so, and maybe what kind of tips you might give to those who are aspiring to do this work?
Just a clarification, I missed one point. about the translation into the classroom or about doing the research itself? I've not quite understood which challenges you're referring to.
Well, translation to the classroom, but also more broadly, if you have other insights as well, more broadly.
So about the translation to the classroom, I think some of the I think an aspect which is really weird about doing this translation with the students is this issue of the instrumentalist aspirations that, for obvious reasons, permeate business schools. So when the lecture that I mentioned before on performance evaluation in refugee camps, there are some people that are for the first time talking and they're all interested and fired up, but there are also some other people that raise their hand, what, I don't need this for my job. So, and then you have to really deconstruct a lot of assumptions as to why. I also had people saying in class, this idea of high reliability organizing and accounting and the operation in this context, and say, how is this relevant? Well, if that's not relevant with all of the things we're experiencing on a daily basis, I don't know what is. So sometimes there is also a bit of an argument to be had with the students about, you know, forcing them to open their eyes to broader debates, because sometimes that is also another barrier. Some people have a very specific, they're in here for the money, and if they don't need it for their job, they're not even going to read the paper. And that is also something that it tends to be polarizing lectures. And I mean, if you are on probation and so on, you also care about student evaluation reports, you know, because that's one of the parameters we, on a very disenchanted level, we have to keep in mind. So there are many trade-offs to be negotiated, and I would argue, I would suggest going incremental. So the first time running the course, I put 2 case studies on grand challenges. This is the second year. I'm weaving in a third and a fourth one. And in a couple of years, I would like to do it only on grand challenges type of examples. But I don't recommend at all to go all in from the first time, because it might be, you also need to test it out to see how students resonate, because you risk something as an early career researcher if you, you know, this aspect, again, at least in my institution, feed directly in your probationary requirements for tenure. So it's risky. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Matteo. So what we want to do now is to get your views on 3 questions that we have prepared. So here you see the 3 questions. So I would like to ask you to go to menti.com, and then you have this 8-digit code, and just please type this in, and it's 3 questions to which we want you to react. And what we'll do is I will then, so we'll have a discussion with Sascha and Matteo about your reaction to these 3 questions. So please take about 3 minutes or so to give your answer to these questions. Okay, I suggest we start a discussion. So, Sascha and Matteo, let's see what the result was for the first question, and maybe then you can just react and tell us how you make sense of this. So, does one sleep better if one does research activities and teaching on grand challenges? And here is how you think about this. So, most of you think that this is the case, but there are also a couple of people, 2 of you said it's actually not, that's not the case, 3 of you are a little bit less sure, and here we have the peak. So, Sascha, Matteo, who wants to react to this?
I think the question came from Matteo because he doesn't.
Sorry?
I think the question came from Matteo because he doesn't sleep better. When I remember our pre-call.
Yeah, exactly. I think the one of those who said that, you know, this is something that I sometimes joke also about in my co-authors, because when I started off, I was really focusing on very specific micro practices and things, and then they got me into this grand challenges research, and all of a sudden I'm not sure I was ready to take that, because now every time I'm reading, it's really something that is really literally keeping me up at night. So there is also, I think, an hidden cost to always dealing with again, thoughts of collapse, environmental devastation, wars, and so on, which I think it's not something I've heard much talked about, but it can be very motivating, and it can give a sense of us doing something worthwhile, but it can also be a bit depressing sometimes. At least that's my very honest opinion on this matter. Yeah, I don't know, Sascha, what do you think about this? But
well, so I think it really very much depends on the grand challenge that you work on, and I think grand challenge per se is by definition the opposite of a neat little problem. So some researchers work on these neat little problems. I think of engineering, for instance, and you find a solution to that neat little problem. You have an invention and you solve that, and you basically find a puzzle piece that solves the puzzle. In grand challenges, wicked problems by definition will not be solved because scholars study them. And I think that in itself can be a source of endless frustration. Personally, I work on topics like the academic system itself, which probably is not as frustrating as people that do research on hunger or refugees. So I think whenever you work on the academic system itself, there's so many issues with the system that you constantly encounter, yet you don't, it's a very different level than the research that you, for instance, do. So I think I'm oftentimes, I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but there clearly oftentimes is a level of frustration that with problems that are so systemic that you might suggest a solution, but you might as well not do it because it will not really change that much. So I completely understand where you're coming from, but I would say with the stuff that I study, it's not as bad keeping me up at night.
So Matteo, just to understand you better, so it's basically the issue for you is that you're just such a small piece. I mean, whatever you contribute, even if you would work 24/7.
It's without going into it's also an issue of this idea, again, to go back to some of the points on this epistemic dimension of the controversy and the cognitive overload. When you start digging deeper in some issues, and not saying anything surprising by any means, but the more you start digging deeper, for instance, on the issue of the environment and so on, there is really sometimes a sense there is no solution. So fossil fuels are not the solution, but electric cars also are not as simple. And the more you dig, the more you find information that sometimes it just leads, at least in my case, when I think about certain purchasing choices or stuff like that, to simply paralysis. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure all of this this uncomfortable dimension is leading me to a more informed decision, because at the end of the day, you just have sometimes to go with your gut, and that's it, because the alternative is paralysis. And it's something that one of the reasons why it motivated us also to write the paper in this way, with this idea of bringing out this issue on the irreconcilable tensions among different disciplines, bodies of knowledge, and so on, which I think it's one of the problems that we were keen to problematize on this paper that creates this uncomfortable sense in some sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying. So let's go to the second question that we had, and let's hear your reaction to this. So the question was, how much support do you receive to engage in outreach activities and teaching on grand challenges? And here is how you reacted to this. Okay, so we seem to have a distribution with two peaks. Some of you say there's very little support, others say there's relatively a lot of support. Few are actually in the middle. Matteo, Sascha, how do you react to this?
It is actually exactly what I said very early in my presentation. What we found is when you look at older scholars that typically then supervise PhD students, they either do a lot of impact work and with that give a lot of support, or they don't do it at all. So there is not that much happening in the middle, where it's a little bit, either they learned it and then they kind of developed a relationship with it, or they don't. And I think that the struggle is when you are an aspiring PhD student and you have the idea, I would like to change the world with my work, and you are in a surrounding where there is very little support for that. How can you basically find a support network, develop it yourself, connect yourself, so you don't end up being one of these older scholars at some point that basically does no impact work, even though you started with the idea of doing that. I think what Matteo alluded to is it's a very good segue, because we oftentimes forget that the students we have in front of us, and all of us are probably teaching, most of them will leave academia and will be part of the rest of the world and do something else. So they are actually a way for us to impact the rest of the world that comes very natural. And so I think taking this challenge really on and teaching, I think I can have an impact on these students in front of me and make a little bit of a change to their life. And then I teach very differently than saying, oh, I have to teach this course again and I don't really care, so I'll just throw something in and do it very quickly. So I think taking this really as a challenge and as an opportunity. And I think also as a PhD student, oftentimes with the research that we do, it takes an enormous amount of time to receive feedback that we're actually doing something useful, something that is good. And oftentimes it takes years until you receive that kind of feedback. And I see with my own PhD student that when they engage in teaching, the feedback is far more immediate. So receiving an evaluation for your teaching, or having individual students talk to you and say that they really took something out of the course, actually can give you a form of self-efficacy that oftentimes in teaching takes years to get that sort of feedback. So I think looking at teaching in that way can actually be very helpful.
And also, if I can, just another consideration, which I think ties together quite nicely, Sascha's paper and presentation with mine, is also another avenue for impact that is connected to teaching. I think that also people in more executive education type of context can also be quite eager to learn on these aspects. And the difference of teaching undergrads versus executives and so on is also that can also provide a lot of other opportunities for engagement and impact and outreach type of activities. So I was doing some executive educational activities this morning, and when talking with these types of people, especially if they have some authority and some resource in their organization that might really want to pursue further this aspect. So the teaching itself, maybe also coupled with maybe some of using grand challenges type of papers and learning or case studies and learning resources of that kind, can also open incredible doors for access and for opportunities for impact and engagement that can be quite meaningful. So also executive education, MBA education could also be, I think, quite a pragmatic avenue to develop impact avenues. And I think in Manchester we call it knowledge exchange, but yeah, those types of activities.
But there seems to be kind of a specialization going on with some groups or institutes or even schools basically focusing on that and others not. And so some of them focus it, they support it, and others don't support it, which might also explain these two peaks. And it's actually also something that Andy Hoffman writes about in his book, basically that more junior scholars, exactly that one. I've read a third of it. Basically, that more and more scholars want to do this impact work, but the environments vary greatly in the degree to which they support that, and that might also be a reason to actually pick a school or to change a school at one point, because the support probably varies to a great degree. So, Imrat, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I guess just this conversation is provoking further questions for me, because we talk about impact through teaching, but in a sense, even if we don't teach, say, on grand challenges, but we engage in teaching, we still have some form of impact, right? So we should raise the question, what impact are we pursuing if we're being more purposeful about it? Maybe a rhetorical question, I don't know.
Yeah. Sascha, Matteo, any?
Yeah, well, I actually think there is, this is a clever way to looking at this. So I had a class a couple of years ago, a bachelor class, and it was on something like emerging technologies in e-commerce. And I really had no idea why I had to teach it, but nobody wanted to do it. It was in some kind of an elective. So I had this group of people in a bachelor business studies program in emerging technologies in e-commerce. And what I did is I went to the first class, talked about it a little bit, and then I tried to understand what is something that they have never done, but that might actually be useful for them. And what I found is nobody has ever told them how to give a decent presentation. And so I took the entire class and made it about giving a compelling presentation and just used the topic of the class, which I couldn't care less about, as something to do the presentation in, as like an arena, but basically it was a class on rhetorics. And that really resonated with them way more than a class on emerging technologies and e-commerce. And I think as scholars, oftentimes we have a lot of freedom in how we interpret specific classes that we teach. And if we teach something that actually resonates with the students, then we get away with way more than we oftentimes think that we do. And so we could have made a class and do a reader on emerging technologies and e-commerce, but I think in the end, they were far happier with having a class that actually taught them something, not on the topic per se, but that is a skill that they will need later on, that we then kind of intertwined with the topic that I was dealt and I kind of had to deal with.
So thanks, Sascha. We actually need to move to the last slides or the last question. So the question was, what percentage of your work time do you spend in work that is meaningful for you? And so here is what you responded. So we see many people actually think they spend almost 100%, or at least a large 60 and more % of the time on work that is meaningful to them. So how do you react to this?
Clearly, these people are not in as many meetings as I am. Like half my life is useless meetings that clearly aren't meaningful. So congrats to you. I would like to have your life.
But that probably also depends on the career stage, right? The privilege is
the amount of projects that you're involved in.
Yeah.
But I think that this issue that you bring up, Sascha, on meetings, especially Zoom meetings and things like that. I mean, at some point during the pandemic, we were all lonely and happy to have our own interaction to a screen and so on. But now there are Zoom meetings for everything and anything. Something that could be an email or something that could be not even that. And then sometimes I have meetings, Zoom meetings with my colleagues, and we realize from the backgrounds we're all in the same office. And we could just, the amount of meetings and how they crowd out motivation, time, and cognitive resources is shocking. And also the other thing is, I think, academic bureaucracy surrounding any type of things we might want to do. You want to do something about, again, let's talk about grand challenges, ethical approvals. It's 1 week of work, data management plans, or all of these hyper complex systems that I think are literally designed to kill ideas. And
Matteo, I think there's a bigger rant coming here, but there we go.
Yeah, no, sorry. I got triggered.
No, I mean, I'm just keeping time in mind. Obviously, we could discuss for hours about this, but we have like 0 minutes left. So I want to wrap it up here and then hand over to Ibrat for the final wrap up. So from my side, let me thank you, Sascha and Matteo, so much for sharing your insights. I also wanted to share one thing about outreach activities. There's actually the ONE SIM Outreach Award, which is awarded by the ONE division and the SIM division of the AOM. And so I help organize the award, and we also share some resources on how to engage in outreach activities, for example, with the recent winners, Michel Anteby and Curtis Chan. So we produced like a 5-minute video in which they tell us about how they spoke to journalists and really specific tips and tricks on that. So maybe that's relevant for some of you as just as a resource, given that we saw that not all institutions support such activities to the same degree. So thank you again, Sascha and Matteo, and I hand over to Ibrat.